So I wanted to look at some of the works in the literal sort of things that I'm seeing. One of the ways that I always approach the work is often as an anthropological investigation. So I'm always trying to kind of approach it and see in a way almost like an animistic way. So it's not classical anthropology. It's really an anthropology of intimacy with the canvas. So I'm always trying to sort of, the first thing I do is I should say that I wrote on dance, contemporary dance, starting in 2015. I wrote around 60 articles, not always large articles. And the thing with writing about dance is that what I do is I watch the performances and I always look at the literal movements and I take notes of everything I see. So that is, I guess, what I would call an anthropological investigation. This sort of like literal being with the work and not being outside the work. And a lot of dance is kind of funny because I do drawings and everything I see I write, almost like a field notebook. So when I come to a show, or when I come to even an artist's work, I often try and do the same thing, a kind of a fieldwork approach, where I'm writing on what I see exactly. And I do it naively, like a child. I'm not trying to invent concepts. The concepts can come after. They usually come after. I don't impose a concept on what I'm seeing on the canvas, on the works. So with these sort of works, I especially work like this, and in general, I like it to look at morphology. So what are the forms and how are the forms moving? What is the relationship between forms? And I think that's the most important stuff. Things to think about in this sort of exhibition and in their works is the rapport between forms. So, often we're talking about identity politics, about all these sort of things. And what we're doing is we're talking about these bodies, but we're just talking about the bodies, like outer shells. There's no kind of inner experience that's felt or even discussed. And when you get to the primordial idea of how bodies are in relation, or the forms, it's literally this. It's literally forms. And that's what I like, because we're going, c'est un mise en abîme. It's like a sort of, it's a back room. It's the back room. I've written in my work, it's the back room. It's a storehouse of thought. So with a work like this, for instance, I come up and I write something like, with this one, I started on this side. And this is, of course, my way I do things. But it's helpful in as I go through different permutations of how I'm looking at a work, of how I write about it, and how I think about it, how I discuss it with the artist. So with this work, for instance, I came up to it and I just wrote poetically, the red is reaching up, but when it reaches up, it's a bit encumbered. It's sploshed. And there's words that come up when I'm doing this that make sense afterwards, and sometimes they can become concepts. With some artists, they become concepts, like the notion of an interior landscape, which is something I came up with a dancer. So the red is reaching up, it's encumbered a bit, it's sploshed, it's ebbing over an edge, it's melding. So see, there's these things that are important. There's really basic elements that I'm doing this when I'm writing almost naively. Like the children not the children are naive. I mean, it's more of like intuition, or just like actually what you see in front of you. So right away when I'm doing this, I'm developing possible concepts to consider the work. The first one is the idea of sploshed. That's a word that doesn't even really exist in English, but it's an idea of like a catalysis, or kind of an explosion. And it's kind of like a messiness, right? So the colors are going over its edge. It's actually going over the edge. So it's not contained. So again, right away, when you're talking about something that's not contained, you're talking about something which is, obviously definitely not. The artist is looking at me now, so they're making fun of me and stuff. But anyway, so they're gone. They're going to let me talk my craziness. But the bottom line is that I come up with these words while I'm writing about the work, and the words don't make sense. Sometimes I make them up. Sometimes they're words maybe from my childhood or something that I've created. So the idea of sploshed. Again, so I'm looking at the red, it's sploshed. It's literally kind of sploshed. It's ebbing over the edge, and the edge is not contained. What's important about this is this notion of fields. And this is what's really important in this exhibition. And, you can go back to people like the Surrealists and this idea of les champs magnétiques, and just the idea of field, right? You can think of a philosopher like Pierre Bourdieu in his notion of the field. So what is the field, right? And how is the field circumscribed? How is it written? How is it divided? Just in a taxi with an African cab driver from Mali telling me that all the countries in the regions were divided and that, you know, he has family in Senegal and in Ivory Coast. So this is a remapping. It's a remapping where we're asking about what are the edges? Are there real edges? Are the edges legitimate, right? And I think what we're doing in this era right now is we're looking at the illegitimacy of these edges and of the lines. And this is a perfect example. And of course, it's not just now that this is happening. We know that in the history of art, whether it's somebody like de Kooning, who was a big influence here, or Refus Global, the Quebec artistic movement, there was already a reneging with globalization in the terms of Refus Global. And so what is important, again, is to go back to creating a vocabulary that goes beyond just territory, because territory obviously has been a very dangerous concept. Well, it's been a very good concept for some people and not for others. So when you think about territories and lines and what's going on, what I'm interpreting and just sort of speculating, because it's all speculation. So the red is splashed, it's ebbing over an edge, it's melding. Melding means it's going into something else. So then, when you think of melding, you might begin to start adding on concepts like the idea of creolization, which comes from Edouard Glissant, and which is not just about a mix of cultures, it's about a composite of many things that come together, but not necessarily all at the same time. It's a consistent reconfiguration of a composite. So when you were talking about melding, that's what's happening a lot through the canvas, throughout this work. There's things that are melding together. Sometimes they're working together, sometimes they're not working together. Sometimes it's not that clear, and we don't really need to pose whether it's working together or not working together. What's important is to have a speculation of what you see in terms of what the forms are here. You don't necessarily need to sort of like understand what it might mean, what the form might be, but I like the literal morphological sort of action that's being seen on the canvas. So I say the red is reaching, it's encumbered a bit, it's splotched, it's ebbing over an edge, and it's melding. So it's melding into the white other spaces. And there seems to be a consolidation. That's the next thing that I write. So at a certain point, it seems like there's a consolidation. So again, using this notion of morphology and of just the rapport between bodies, we're speaking about a larger concept, the larger concept of bodies and society and how we consolidate, how we relate, the relationality. So literally that's why I see the show, one of the reasons I see the show important is because it's a little representation of fields, speculative fields, fields where we can play and where there's a sort of modular thing that you can play with. You can take this, that, but the point is there's rapports and how we look at rapports, how things are related, not just people, but actual forms. Now, there seems to be a consolidation, and not quite at bay, but somewhere to the left, so I go here, pushing just inside of the canvas, there is this consolidation. Next, I write that such motions of a fight for space are real in terms of our bodies, celestial bodies also, and how they might move and how they might jostle. So as I write, it is the extreme issues of rapport. So that's what I'm really liking in this exhibition and in these works, is the notions of rapport that are literally shown, illustrated on the canvases. The next thing I write is, at some points you see that one of the forms is seeking a position. And ultimately, at some points, all the interests of the positions might actually come together. There might be a consolidation. I write in French, it might be à coup prix. So there's a consolidation, and it might come into a condensed version of all the tendencies. So that's another thing. What are the tendencies? Like, that's another thing I like to look at when I'm looking at an artist or a painter, what are the recurring tendencies in their work? Obviously, the smartest ones can often hide the tendencies, but the reality is there are usually tendencies. There's anchors that you'll see coming back through the works. You'll see this. I just saw this in one of the old works of Clovis, a work from quite a while ago, this sort of configuration here. I've seen that before. and we see them recurring. He seems to be developing them, entering them into the language, out of the language, rethinking how they can be part of the language that he's doing. These things are very interesting. We'll see that with the next canvas, is these spurts. I call them sprites. There's these kind of individual bifurcations, or sort of like just like these like explosions, these lines. So what are these? There's no real meaning of what these are in a sense, but it really is a way to start to try, kind of think about things. So I continue and I say the red is moving up the canvas, and at some points there's a bifurcation. And that's important because these artists are very inspired by literal scientific principles. Whether it's the idea of the universe, whether the idea of quantum physics, and all these sort of things, all these sort of conceptual concepts that are legitimately scientific. But what's interesting is their approach to it is definitely sort of elaborating those concepts, but actually speculatively actually engaging with those concepts and how you might rethink something or even add to it, because something like quantum is already a radical notion that we haven't had actually sort of fully grasped. So I do write that the red is moving up the canvas, and at some points there's a bifurcation. So a bifurcation, if I understand it correctly in scientific principles, is where there's sort of two things like sort of always going sort of together at each other, and then there's this continuous motion maybe between two things, and then out of that comes something which is different than those original two things. So again, a nice concept to rethink how we think about our rapports in society, especially in a society where there are real issues of difference and of trying to find a way to live together. Now, the next thing I write is I see a series of forms coming decidedly to converse, but also in search of the rapports and what rapports might and could be. So these are conversations. He is having conversations within the canvas between the forms and with his other work in the past. So there's this sort of metatextuality that's going on that you don't need to know. But already when we go to the next piece, you're going to already say to yourself, oh, wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I saw that before. And you get to sort of understand that there's conversations that he's creating that are interior to his own elaboration of his interior landscape, but also related to his other canvases, and then related to other artists, whether it's Kandinsky, a very important influence in him, whether it's the Refus Global, whether it's somebody like the Haitian painter Franck Etienne, or his old influences like André Pierre. Now this is very important. What I'm going to talk about now is because Clovis, the artist, who I haven't even mentioned, Clovis Alexandre Desvarieux, and the name of the painting is Cantique du Cantique, 2021. And the size is 26 by 2 centimeters, 26.2 centimeters by 101.6 centimeters. Clovis has, in the past, but I don't like to make the sort of clean division between this and that, but he's been sort of doing more iconographic work. Very influenced by the Loas and different divinities, and presences in Haitian, in voodoo and other sort of religious manifestations there. But to be very frank, I have always seen his work as always having been quote-unquote abstract, or what I would rather call radical gestures. From the beginning, there's already been this tendency of a sort of rapport between forms. So when, for instance, Clovis actually, represents Le Baron Samedi, who is this like the midnight robber type of, divinity at the crossroads, the sort of divinity of death, but of course much more complicated than that. But when he actually does these representations of these personae, they're almost quantum figures of how we've seen them represented in the past. You start to see these figures early on represented by artists like Hector Hippolyte. And Hippolyte, already there's a quantum sort of representation, but what we have now is that there's a complete entrance into a fragmentation of what that image is. And if you really think about it, if these are actually divinities, part of a sort of a metaphysical immaterial plane, their likenesses shouldn't be whole to begin with. So this sort of like conversation that's been had with Clovis's work has been in the past iconographic and now is abstract. I wouldn't agree with that, because that division between the abstract and iconographic, I think it's a false division. And this is why it's important for these artists to be contending with notions like abstraction and abstract expressionism and stuff like that, because what they're doing is that they're actually able to question this sort of the distance that's always been made between figurative and abstract, right? You know, these very sort of like not necessarily real oppositions. They're actually there's a sort of there's a movement between figuration and abstraction, and you know, you can find some figurative elements in this if you want to. So it's not necessarily just abstract. Continuing with this sort of like morphological study, so to speak, for the work, you know, the red sort of like pushing with the pink, the green splosh. It's all these sort of things. It's a series of forms coming to decidedly either converse with each other, have a conversation with each other, or also or in a search for what the rapports might be or could be between the forms. You know, the white into the pink, the yellow into the yellow. This consistent sort of almost alchemical sort of like rapport or space. And that's something interesting to think about also, is the idea of this alchemical sort of space that's being created here. Now, of course, you know, you think about Clovis's adherence to a work of Kandinsky like the spirit, finding the spiritual in art, and you start to understand that this spiritual quest or this spiritual sort of experimentation is something that's obviously quite common in our society today, where we've reached I guess what you could call the bottom of Western certitudes, or as in French say, nous sommes, you know, it's from Glissant, where he talks about how the certitudes of the West have finally reached their rock bottom. And I think this is very important to talk about, because the thing that's very important in this exhibition, and I quote Zizek Zizek, is the idea of the open field. And this really is a great example. I didn't imagine in my dreams ever that I would be able to sort of be involved with an exhibition where you can literally see the field of whether it's a material, the physical field, whether it's geographic, geological, the field is sort of this sort of ineffable and real space actually shown and experimented with in canvases. Now, this is important because Zizek, the Slovenian philosopher, has said during the Occupy Wall Street marches, he says, the system has lost its self-evidence. It's lost its automatic legitimacy. And now the field is open. This is very important achievement, because the whole idea of the legitimation of this one field, or how we define the field, how we see the field, is gone. And this is the moment where artists like Clovis, and also other interesting artists like Carl-Philippe, Simonise, and also globally sort of recognized artists like Mark Bradford, Julie Meritou, Jack Whitten, and of course, you know, you go back generations to other sort of artists. They've all been playing with how we represent the field and how we speculate on the representation of the field. You see this really a lot in Jack Whitten's work, and Bradford and Meritou, and you see it in this work, which really brings Clovis into this global conversation, which he's always been involved with, actually. You know, but we're actually seeing it in a real literal way in some ways. So just to end on this canvas, one of the things, there's a lot of words that I like to use when I'm talking about these works. I like to talk about ecosystems. Literally, these are like experimental ways of looking at how ecosystems might work. And we're not just talking about natural ecosystems. We're talking about the idea of bodies, real bodies, not real bodies. The idea of space, of public space. Do you know what I mean? This is another thing we talked about in the interview with Le Devoir, is the sort of the disappearance of public space in these societies that Habermas talks about. You see it in the artists in what they're trying to present. They're presenting spaces of reflection, rumination, of rethinking, of recalibration, of remapping, recartographie, and definitely not reterritorialization. Another thing to think about is the idea of the intemporal. Very important idea because, we're moving beyond this sort of like these constructed notions of time by corporations, by governments, etc. And this work really falls within that, and that's important, especially being a Haitian artist, because the first sort of introduction to Haitian art actually occurs in André Malraux's book, The Intemporal, where he actually decides to take out his last chapter on El Greco and actually be with this group of painters called Saint Soleil in Haiti, because as André Breton would say, we in Europe are writing about surrealism, but these artists in Haiti are actually doing surrealism. So with that, I think we're going to move on. But before that, there's also the notion of archipelago. And that's really something that's very interesting for me, this idea of archipelagic thinking. Another Glissantian idea. Very important because you have a series of archipelagos going on in various regions. There's different archipelagos here. And you have the rapports within the archipelagos. And this is all speculation. This is my vision that I'm not imposing, but it's what I see. And it's a different way of seeing. I'm interested in how we can look at things in a different way. You have different archipelagos throughout the canvas. And what you see is the different ways that the different inlets, islets, islands, all sort of work within and with each other. So let's move on to the next work with that. Good? Okay. This serves as a sort of introduction to this exhibition, which is called The Secret Language of the Universe, Le Langage Secret de l'Univers. The artists are Clovis, Alexandre, Desvarieux, and Carl-Philippe Simonise. This notion of the universe, what is it? How do we really think about it? This organizing principle, is it something simply that we think about when we're thinking about space? What is our personal universe? How do we rethink about it? How do we think about remapping? Comment est-ce qu'on parle de la cartographie, the remapping of art history, the remapping of sensibilities? So, what could possibly be meant by a universe? Are we simply referring to the astronomical unit holding various constellations, bodies, and other materialities? Or can we extend this notion to enforce a form of planetary thinking that would think of a universe rather than a global thing, but rather at the micro level of interior landscapes we are all permitted to explore and dive deep into? If there's ever been a moment to think in this way, it is now. The European city capital of culture this year is the city of Eleusis in Greece. This is mind-blowing for any of us that have been studying ancient Greek rituals since we were kids, like myself, because the notion that Eleusis, this real important unit of Western civilization and the old rituals, these pagan rituals that existed before monotheism, and that they would actually name it, not just name it the capital of culture, but actually spend a whole year revisiting that at a level, a governmental level, at a city level, a municipal, as a material and an immaterial level. So this is the moment where we kind of think about what they call the Gaia. And again, this is a planetary thinking, a constellation way of living, archipelagic ruminating, cosmological explorations. The point in a post-colonial age is to move away from the thing of masses, solids, and universals, and diving into other ways of thinking or our cosmological circumstances on this planet. One to one we walk, but how much and how often do we join? Our age of focusing much attention on the lovely idea of subjectivity, but also missing out on the grand opportunity to look at how forms, shapes, human, non-humans find rapports. These works, if they are anything, delineate the importance of ruminating on rapports, agencement, agencies, poetics of relations, between the forms, the ideas in their forms, and between the rapports and the dialogues the painters are having with each other and with the history of art. The universe is a vast expanse of space and time. that contains both material and immaterial objects and bodies. It serves as an organizing principle that holds these objects together and allows for the measurement of the distances and proportions between them. Clovis, Alexandre Desvarieux, and Carl-Philippe Simonise use painting and other graphic forms to explore the creation of personal, social, and or imaginary universes and their languages. Important, the languages. Desvarieux' work focuses on the movement and the stillness of a field of space, of a space that represents the beginning, or that could represent the beginning or end of a constellation or universe, while Simonise, Carl-Philippe Simonise, delves into the internal landscape of their own universe, examining the relationships between graphic and emotional and affective forms. Both artists use the canvas as a way to explore their own personal, social, and or imagined understanding of the universe, breaking free from the conventional notions of what a universe is. Moving on. So again, we come back to Desvarieux' work and sort of bringing up sort of the things we were talking about before. Again, a language in itself, unto itself, the work. Of course, a language informed by the history of art, whether it's Francis Bacon or Kandinsky or André Pierre or Franck Etienne or Kandinsky. The reality is that, we have this syncretic, and it's important because Desvarieux has been talking about syncretism quite a lot in a very, very, very eloquent way. You have this syncretic series of traditions, these traditions that are syncretized, creolized, and you have all of these coming into this, what I see as a sort of the beginning really of an original form for this painter. And you have these forms that are coming back from his other works. Again, the sprite that I spoke about before, that seems to come out at certain levels. The sprite is here again. For me, it's this kind of a sovereign explosion or sovereign, perhaps even implosion. And this work is called Ambiguïté Sentimentale. It is 2022. It's 152.4 centimeters by 182.88 centimeters. And this is this work is really massive apotheosis in this artist's work. This is a work that he's done since we've started having conversations. And this exhibition is not just about painting, it's about a series of conversations that have been taking place over almost a year with Vivardy, Boursiquot, with Clovis, Desvarieux, Alexandre Desvarieux, with Carl-Philippe Simonise, and with Oski, with Joseph Alexandre Villers. These are conversations that have been happening where I've been sort of going on as this sort of like intrepid anthropologist, visual anthropologist, sort of diving into their world and sort of really coming out of this where parts of my conversation might appear in the work, or part of this work might appear in Carl-Philippe's work, and different conversations that have really come to this. And, I look at the work, again, is it figurative, is it abstraction? It's not important, perhaps this is a Loa here, who knows? But the point is that you have, again, these challenging of how we look at cosmologies and cosmological systems, how we look at maps, how we look at how space is delineated. And of course here we get into something very interesting, which we see in Clovis's work, Mr. Desvarieux' work, is the notion of what is the movement on the canvas. So the movement on the canvas, I always see it as going in different possible ways. It could either go as centripetal or as centrifugal, meaning that either it goes into itself, or out of itself. And these, again, are important. When you're thinking about living in a world where we're trying to work on rapports, I think at the most basic morphological level, what are our movements as personal people in our personal lives? Are these movements centripetal or centrifugal? Or are they both at once? So they're I would not even venture to say too much more about this work because the work is so rich that it begs the question to even try and actually analyze it. You know, it's a feeling. It's something that makes you feel there. Move on. Now we move on to Carl-Philippe Simonise, the other artist in the exhibition. This work is called Le Mur de Planck, the Wall of Planck. It is 2022. It's 136 centimeters by 181 centimeters, and he's referring to the work of Max Planck, the physicist. Now, literally, when we came in here, one of the things that Carl said is that he had never actually seen his own work until we had it here. What he means by that is the way that we see it, the way of seeing. And when we put this up, the first thing I thought of is that this is literally the sun in our actual exhibition. It's actually a celestial body, which he's actually created in an exhibition, and it literally became the sun when we were actually making the exhibition. The exhibition which works not just through, in front viewing, but through diagonals. And, this painting really illuminates a lot of the other work in a sense. And here, again, we move to the point of this show, which is to look at how or what we think a universe is, whether it's celestial, personal, etc. But how do bodies move within universes? How do forms move within universes? And here we have a different take on this with Carl-Philippe than Clovis, Alexandre Desvarieux. What you have here is you have different rapports between the actual forms. We always like to say amongst us that we feel like the forms in Carl-Philippe's work seem to be working more together rather than against each other or in different sort of manifestations than in Clovis Desvarieux's work. But that's not exactly true. The reality is we have almost like a more microscopic view of the forms than we actually have in Desvarieux's work. Desvarieux always says that his work is more, it's airier. Il y a plus d'air dessus. And if you think about that, you might even make the sort of, you might even venture to say that the Desvarieux is still at somewhat of a macro level, whereas Desvarieux has actually taken on, imagine going into just one line or one form or one dot of Desvarieux's work, and in that dot, we might actually find this, the interior, the actual bones, the actual cells that are inside of this. So the work speaks for itself in the sense that you really have these forms moving together, moving against each other. And Simonise often likes to say that the colors sometimes in his work are often fighting against each other for space on the canvas. So you have this other interpretation of a quote-unquote universe. But literally, you have this examination of the microforms and how the microforms might dialogue with each other, against each other, with each other, at the same time against each other, or maybe even a more complex relationship we don't know. These could be cells, these could be atoms, this could be osmosis. The reality is that it's a visual representation of how we might speculate on how forms have rapports with each other. Now, this is very important to think about because what you have here is you have a conversation, not just Carl-Philippe with their self and their work, but you have a conversation with Desvarieux. And to end, I just go back to Desvarieux's work here, and you see this work was actually done with them together, in the studio together. This is actually Desvarieux's work, but what's interesting is you see a little bit of Carl-Philippe in this work. You have one thing with Carl-Philippe's earlier work is there was what I call arenas in the work. We'll probably put some visuals of that in the video. His old works, which just really drew me to his work, reminded me of the arenas that Francis Bacon has in his work. These areas, literal areas, and or again arenas, and you don't see it as you still see them in Carl-Philippe's work, but here it seems like he might have transposed this into Clovis's imagination because they did this work in the studio together while he did another work on his own. So you have these arenas, these different platforms, But then you have this sort of, again, this question, this sort of rumination on how forms sit with each other, how they are with each other. And ultimately, if you really think about this show, what it's really speaking in many ways about is how we can be with, and not just be at, be around, but there's a being with in this show. And that's why when people come in here, they feel a kind of complete sort of catalysis, a complete sort of like absorption in the colors, because what we've created here is we've created a public space where there's no dialogue on anything particularly social or political, but rather something even stronger, something that is that and it is beyond that, something that really thinks about how can you be with a piece of art, an object of art. How can you be with the person in the room? And I'm happy that I think we've accomplished this in bringing people here and figure out how we can be with each other in this space and how people can be with these works. Thank you very much. My masterclass. We're done.